Well, on this wonderful rainy day as I drive home from work, I figure it's time for me to voice a bit of a, how would you say it? Personal peeve that took the form of a YouTube comment thread. It's on Skull Gladiatoria's recent video on helmet types, medieval helmet typologies. Somebody recommended the work of a man named Raphael D'Amato. D'Amato is an Italian scholar specializing, again in quotes, in Byzantine, again in quotes, study. Basically, every time I mention him as a scholar or his area of study, just imagine air quotes. I've interacted with him online, although some of my friends who are actual scholars have interacted with him more. And for this rant to become relevant, I do need to sort of talk about my personal religious beliefs and my personal ethnic background. I'm a Serb. Yes, I was born in America, but I'm a member of Serbian ethnicity. I was raised Serbian Orthodox. I identify strongly with Serbia and Serbian culture. I am a Serb. When I was, personal anecdote, when I was very young, this is so young that I don't actually remember this, I had it told to me by my father, we went to visit some of his relatives, and one of them was an old woman. I can't remember her relation. I think she was his aunt. But I remember Dad was always very proud of this. He said, she looked at me and said, pravi krajnica, which meant true krajnica, which is a resident of an area called Krajina, which is a Serbian province. It was meant that I look like somebody from Serbia. That was a point of pride for my dad and somewhat for me too. But I'm Orthodox, and I was raised Orthodox, and I know some small bit about Orthodox iconography. I've been in Orthodox churches. I've talked to my priest. I've read some, not extensive literature, but it's Orthodox produced literature about Orthodox iconography, which in broad strokes is the same for all of Eastern Europe, which all fell under the under the cultural influence of Byzantium. And one feature of Orthodox religious art is that an icon, a religious image, is supposed to resemble as much as possible the actual appearance of the person it depicts, insofar as that's possible. Because of that, icons, rather than being sort of freely up to the artist to sort of decide how to represent it, were copied repeatedly, usually from originals that could go back centuries. Because you're trying to capture something of the actual appearance of an actual person. And if the best way to do that is to go to the earliest source for what that person looked like, which is usually the earliest icons of that person. So by the 8th century, you've got hundreds of copies of 4th century icons, of 4th century and earlier saints. And the fact that they're copies mean that they're not, or they're trying not to update the material culture depicted in the icon. Material culture is like clothing, armor, weapons, utensils, things like that. They're trying not to update it because they're trying to accurately represent an earlier piece of art. This isn't wrong or bad or unimmersive. It's just a different take from what is normal, what was normally expected in Western Europe, where in order to bring an immediacy to the art, it was drawn in such a style as to make all the material culture contemporary with the artist. So, in 1250, you will draw all the biblical characters as if they also lived in 1250, or you'll draw saints as if they lived contemporary to you. A great example of this is the statue of Saint Maurice at Magdeburg Cathedral. Saint Maurice is a 2nd century saint. He is depicted at Magdeburg as a mid-13th century German knight in terms of his equipment. You wouldn't have done that in Eastern Europe. You would have found an icon of Saint Maurice, the earliest one you could find, and tried to copy that. It was also regulated by several, not several, but there was sort of a body of authority within the Orthodox Church that regulated the production of icons so that they couldn't stray too far. That doesn't mean that they never depicted contemporary material culture. There are several icons where a lot of the armor is completely nonsensical, but then there'll be a sword that looks exactly what you would expect to find in Western Europe. Because obviously the artist at some point went, I know what a sword looks like, and drew a sword. And just as he knew a sword to look, rather than copying it off the icon. There are others where it's very obvious that they were copying earlier work. And the vast majority of the time, that's what they were doing. And through transcription errors, you sometimes get, in fact, frequently get, clothing, arms, armor, etc., that don't visually make sense. If you rendered this into a three-dimensional object, it wouldn't work. It would be impossible to wear for a variety of reasons. But the point of it wasn't to represent contemporary culture. It was to represent the culture of the time that the saint it depicted actually lived. That's what the Byzantines found immersive and what they valued in their religious art. Very little Byzantine or Eastern European secular art from the medieval and pre-medieval period survives. What does survive represents a material culture not wholly dissimilar to Western Europe. It's not the same, but it's not as completely dissimilar as the religious art portrays. And if you look at Byzantine military manuals, they don't mention any of the strange forms of sort of antique-looking armor found in the icons. They mention contemporary armor that would have been not out of place in Western Europe. When you look at city and castle inventories from Greece and Serbia, you see purchases of arms and armor from Western Europe in bulk. And in fact, those purchases led to the rise of several Western European cities as centers of production. When you hear somebody talk about the Italian export style of armor, they were exporting that armor to Byzantium and Serbia and Greece and Bulgaria and Romania. That's where it was all going to, or at least a huge portion of it was going to those Eastern European Orthodox countries. It doesn't show up in the art because the art was not meant to depict contemporary material culture. It had a different focus, and this is similar to in the modern day. There are I've seen two different ways of approaching Shakespeare. One, I've seen versions of Shakespeare that update everything to make it seem as if it's happening contemporary to the time when the movie was produced. I can't remember the name of the film off the top of my head. But then there are others that try to set it in Shakespeare's time. And then there are others that try to set it at the time when it would have happened in history. For example, a really good example is Laurence Olivier's versions of Henry V and Richard III, which are just masterful examples of that. But you could say that Eastern Europe was taking that Laurence Olivier approach to it, whereas Western Europe was taking a more updated, contemporary approach. Neither is wrong inherently, but they are distinct and different, and to claim that they're the same is incorrect. It misses the mark. And the reason for claiming that they're, weirdly, the reason that this fellow, to get all the way back to the point, somebody recommended a book by Raphael D'Amato, the man I mentioned at the start of the video. Raphael D'Amato claims that Eastern and Western iconographic traditions were the same. The reason he does this is so that he can create an image of Eastern Europe with bizarre and unusual and exotic forms of weapons and armor and clothing unseen in the West, and also unmentioned in text sources and completely absent from the archaeological record. So, I posted a response and said, hey, just word of warning, Raphael D'Amato does not get the difference. And I got criticized as an Orientalist trying to overstate the differences to create an impression of the other. An impression of the other of my own culture, the culture that I was raised as a part of. That Byzantine culture is not dead, and though I was born and raised in America, I was raised as part of that Byzantine culture. It's my culture. It's not Raphael D'Amato's. And to be completely frank, Raphael D'Amato is doing far more to otherize Eastern Europe than I am by his claims that the iconographic tradition was the same, because he's using it to paint a picture of Eastern Europe as bizarre and foreign to Western Europe, when it wasn't. It fundamentally wasn't. The material culture, yes, it was different. There was more access to cotton and silk in Eastern Europe than there was in Western Europe. That's because of their advantageous position on several trading routes for that. Stuff like embroidery and decorations on the clothes were different, but overall, were they so completely different that the Eastern Europeans into the 12th century or the 14th century looked like cosplay Romans? No. They weren't. Orthodox iconography to try to claim that they did is a far worse case study of this Orientalism than me explaining my own culture. It is not Orientalism to be, I guess in this person's mind, an Oriental. It's like, I am not a foreigner to my own culture. Don't ever try to pull that bullcrap on me. All you'll do is make me angry. It will. And I am avoiding cussing as hard as I possibly can right now. Because it irks me to no end to be told by somebody of Western European descent that I am wrong about my own culture that I was raised in. Alright? I am not a Western European. I am a Serb. I am an Orthodox Christian Serb. I was raised as an Orthodox Christian Serb. To treat me as though I don't understand what that means is not only patronizing, but extremely. It grabs at the core of who I am and fills me with rage. And I am trying to keep that down. Because for this random Westerner who has never studied Orthodox traditions whatsoever, tell me that I'm wrong about my culture is beyond the pale. And I'm going to leave it there. This has been a somewhat rambly video. Matt Easton did good work on his video. Go watch it. Just fill it, if anybody watches this, just fill it with comments saying that Rafael D'Amato should never be taken seriously again. And that's that. Thank you for watching if you indeed did.